What is vibin', everyone? This is Vish, and today I'm going to be connecting politics with spirituality. Before we start, let's first take a nice deep breath together. So let's start by taking a nice deep breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. We needed that breath because now more than ever, the tensions have been really tight. The votes are still being counted, and the race is really neck to neck, with Joe Biden on the Democrat side and President Trump on the Republican side. With the ongoing pandemic with COVID, as well as increasing racial tensions that are happening across the country, this election has been one of the most important ever. And with that in mind, it's super important that we're all involved and seeing what's happening and are all active participants in this ongoing process. Now, before I connect the politics to the spirituality, I'm gonna first talk about the personal experience I've had with politics and all the views that I've had over time. So politics honestly was very interesting to me. I've been watching the debates with John McCain, Obama, like all those back in the day when I was like 5, 6, 7 years of age, and grew up watching it with the dad. I would say after elementary school, I kind of got disconnected from politics, really wasn't as into it, and didn't have any strong views on any political issues. Fast forward to high school. It's senior year, and it's one of the biggest elections of the time. It was between President Trump and Hillary Clinton. Now, before I express the personal views I've had over time, I do want to make it clear that this video's intent isn't to persuade you to pick a side. It's really focused on connecting spirituality with politics and hopefully using this advice to make your sound decisions about your views. So it's senior year, it's Hillary versus Trump. And to be honest, everyone was surprised, whether you're conservative or liberal, that Trump had made it so far. I mean, we just knew him as a show businessman, and it had been a lot of talk, and I'd seen a few interviews here and there where he was talking about running for election, but it never seemed serious. And to see him go from the jokes to, at least what I thought were jokes, to a serious kind of thing seemed very surprising. And not only was that surprising, but the fact that he went from show business to actually making it into politics and winning votes in the primaries and then eventually the election, we were all surprised. Now again, I do want to emphasize, regardless of what views you had, I would say more or less people on both sides were surprised. Now, I did grow up in Long Island, New York, a school called Smithtown, and it was a really cool school. However, very not so diverse, and it was 95% white, and I would say the majority, roughly 80% or so, of the students were Republican and were very conservative. Now, the Republican types of people that we're talking about in Long Island, or specifically Smithtown where I lived, were more of the upper class Republican people. This led to most of the students that I was aware of having primarily conservative economic views, however, pretty liberal social views. Now, something interesting about the South is that I love standing out and don't really like to be a part of the big majority ever. And so when I was in New York, I would do this thing to where I was always boasting being from California for whatever reason. And so I never liked being a part of New York at the time. And it's funny because after I moved to Texas, specifically Austin, and going to UT, I started boasting that I was from New York. In general, I like standing out. And so although the views at the time were pretty liberal at the time, I definitely used the fact that everyone was conservative to be extra liberal and stand out even more from the crowd. Now fast forward to UT, so coming to Austin, I mean Texas in general, I assumed was a very conservative state, but Austin was a very liberal city, especially UT. I mean, in general, most college campuses are very liberal. And so after coming here, I was exposed to another different side of people. Being exposed to the other side, I was able to put things into perspective and wasn't as strong in the liberal side anymore. If anything, I became more moderate in terms of the views. And so what that means is that certain issues I would lean conservative, certain issues I would lean liberal. Now getting into the spiritual dimension of politics, what I've been learning throughout this whole process and journey is to never identify with anything. What that really comes down to, just from a very high level summary, is not being attached to anything, whether it's from a country, whether it's from a political party, whether it's anything, honestly. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't serve your role as a part of that group. You can still serve your role, but to identify yourself and give yourself that label, you're forming an attachment, and that's the complete opposite of the spiritual process. Spirituality is all about detachment and not being identified with anything. The moment you identify with something, you bring along attachment. And what does attachment lead to? It leads to unconsciousness. And overall, the goal I've learned from spirituality is to learn to become more conscious, and not just learn it, but practice it. And so getting in the direction of unconsciousness defeats the whole purpose. That is why currently today I do not identify with any political party. Now, just because you don't identify with anything doesn't mean that you can't vote and you shouldn't vote. No, you must vote. I think it's very, very important. Like I said, it's really important to understand that you can serve a role, you can serve a purpose, you can partake in action without identification. And so I currently don't label the self as Democrat or Republican or Libertarian or anything. Currently where I stand and where the spiritual journey has taken me, I've realized that I would never identify with any political party. Now I'm going to be talking about the significant importance of democracy and how that connects to the spirituality. First off, I'm going to have to do a special shout out to Sadhguru. He's done a tremendous amount of influence in terms of all the cool realizations I've had in the spiritual journey. And so what I'm talking about is definitely inspired from Sadhguru and even Eckhart Tolle to an extent, so I do want to shout out them. And so the first concept I want to talk about is having your vote be secret. So back to the whole identification part of what I was talking about earlier, I would highly encourage you all to vote, but that doesn't mean you have to stamp yourself as Democrat or Republican or Biden or Trump and put it on to every single other person. It's really important for people to make their own sound judgment, and when people are just blasting their views as well as support for all these different candidates, whatever side you root for, on the people, it really just creates a bunch of noise for the facts and to allow the individual to make their own research and make their own sound judgment. It really just creates a bunch of unconscious emotion, which isn't the best when I think making the right decision to vote. So what that means is it's really important to keep your ballot secret, and there's a reason they call it the secret ballot. So when you're going to vote, you're not going to vote with your family and your whole crowd. I mean, it's all secret, and so there's a reason as to why the process is kept that way. Now, it's totally okay to have educated debates and discussions and even arguments with people about politics. There's nothing wrong with that. Just identifying yourself with that political party and then using that identification really just leads to a bunch of unconscious talks and doesn't really lead to productive discussions. To recap all of what I was saying about the secret ballot, it really comes down to identification and announcing to the world who you voted for, really just taking away from what's really happening in the election and all the facts that are occurring on both sides and all the real policies that people stand for. And I think it's important to have more discussion and talks over those things rather than I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, Joe Biden, Trump. I mean, it's okay to vote for who you want, but to identify yourself just takes away from the important matters. I do want to mention that there's nothing wrong with supporting a candidate. You can wholeheartedly support who you want. I just want to emphasize the whole identification and yelling of the label as a bit unconscious. Now, getting into the voting, I know I mentioned a couple times earlier in the video, but please go vote. It is super important. And a lot of people have the talks and conversation about, oh, my vote doesn't matter, or this vote won't count, what's the point in going? But it really comes down to a very similar analogy that I would love to compare to, and that's recycling. There was a time where people just threw trash on the streets and were like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's just one plastic water bottle. However, eventually when people became more conscious about the environment, they were able to realize that it's important to recycle. And similarly, people should understand that voting has a very similar consequence. Now, in the grand scheme of things, one vote might not be that significant. However, what does matter is the consciousness of the individual, which represents the collective consciousness. If everyone were to think that way and say that their vote doesn't count, it would lead to fewer people voting, and the election would be dictated by a lot fewer people who probably won't represent the whole. A really cool spiritual story I heard about is about a girl who was walking on the beach, and she was collecting a bunch of sea turtles and she was chucking them back in the water to their home. And there were thousands, if not millions, of sea turtles thrown all over the beach, and a man who was just walking by happened to notice that, and he went up to the girl and asked her, why are you doing this? And then she said, I'm just returning the sea turtles back to their homes. And the man responded with laughter, and he was like, silly girl, there's millions of sea turtles out there. What are you gonna do? What difference do you make? Then the girl very consciously responded by taking another sea turtle and then gently putting it back into the water and said, "The difference was made to that one." Hopefully this story was able to highlight the importance of voting and how every individual matters and makes a difference. Now, further talking about how important the votes are, it's really important to understand and realize how it is a significant privilege to be able to vote and have a say in what is happening in the society that is ruling us. It is a serious privilege because even today, in this present day, there are many societies across the world where people don't individually have a say. And even just looking at the history of the United States, there was a time where women can vote, there was a time where people of color can vote, and now that we all have those rights, it's super important to exercise that. The progression of the United States and the progression of the world as a whole goes to show the development of consciousness, and it's important not just to observe the consciousness, but also to participate in it and get involved. Now, democracy does have its flaws, and the United States government isn't perfect by no means. Whether it's redlining or just lobbyists having a huge say in what happens in the government, it's clearly not perfect. So I do want to highlight how being conscious and being a voter in America just doesn't mean you vote and let it go, but like I said earlier, you want to be involved in the whole process and point out all the unconscious, including those things. Now, I'm going to be talking about the collective consciousness and connect that to the politics. Connecting back to an earlier topic, I would really want to emphasize how important it is to do your own research and to never identify with anything, including a political party. And what this means is doing your own research and looking at news on both sides, whether it's Fox on the conservative end or CNN on the liberal end, and observing both as critically as possible and consciously as well. And the reason this is especially important is because if we were to just identify and pick a side based off of what our parents said or our friends said, that's really not speaking for the self. The next part of collective consciousness I want to discuss with you was the topic of acceptance. Acceptance is a huge part of the spiritual journey. Acceptance is the end of suffering. Suffering is a space between what is and what isn't, and you laying in that space. Now, acceptance doesn't mean that you just sit there and say it is what it is and do nothing, but to take the proactive conscious action. Now, where I want to go with acceptance is the acceptance of the results of the election. Now, whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, whether you're conservative or you're liberal, regardless of the unconscious identification with the political party, it's really important that we accept who the president is, regardless of who he is. Now, just to point out an example, when Trump became president, back when I was especially liberal in terms of the views, I really wasn't a big fan and honestly would say things like, oh, you know, he's not my president and so on. So I'm being open about those unconscious statements that were being made back in the time. But now with this spiritual journey, I've been able to make the conscious realization that regardless of what side you choose, it's important to accept the president because whether you like it or not, he is a president. And now why it's super important to accept the president isn't just accept the individual as itself, but it's the respect to the democracy. Democracy is a good representation of the collective consciousness, and every single individual that votes contributes to the pool of consciousness. This pool is filled with unconscious, conscious, and people everywhere in between. And so the combination of all these different individuals, when making their votes, at the end display the collective consciousness of the people. On both sides, it's important to respect the democracy and accept the results and accept the president. Now, that doesn't mean that you say nothing after the president is elected and just be quiet and suppress your views and voice. Not at all. What I'm trying to get at is accepting the president as he is, and if the president makes a mistake or does very unconscious things, it is very important to call those out, and if need be, you kick him out of office. But to kick out an upcoming president before he's even elected, that's just not the most conscious thing, as well as the most respectful thing to democracy, as well as the collective consciousness. So to just summarize what we just discussed with politics and spirituality, I first talked about the personal history I've had with politics and connecting that to the spiritual journey that happened more recently. And then I talked about the importance of democracy, as well as connecting that to the collective consciousness. With all that being said, I urge you to vote, regardless of what your view is, and hope this video was informative as well as spiritually radiating. And with that, I sincerely thank you for taking the time to listen to everything I had to say. And I know this is a very sensitive matter, it being politics. I did want to open that up and connect to spirituality, because spirituality has been meaning a lot to the self, especially in the past 2 years. And with that, if you have any other questions, just comment down below or reach out to me on Instagram at VishVibez. Make it a great day, take it joyfully, and stay conscious.